Zhang sent to a friend. After you left, I dreamed of visiting your home. The tiny hallway, the curving balustrade. But there was only the spring moon over the courtyard, shining on fallen blossoms for one no longer there. Okay, we have almost finished the section of this book dedicated to heptasyllabic quatrains. In fact, there are only two left. Today's poem by Zhang and an anonymous one that we will be reading tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. Also significantly, these last two poems break up to a point the chronological progression in the section. Until now, the poems have been placed in rough chronological succession, and in fact, the poems that we read in the previous days, Han Wo's, Wei Chuang's, Cheng Tao's, they were late Tang writers, many of them continuing to write after the fall of the Tang dynasty. Chang Bi takes us backward from what we can glimpse in the very short biography of his that is appended in this volume. Chang Bi was basically a mid-Tang poet. We don't have a lot of details about his life, but we know that he tried to pass and failed the examinations during the Chengjuang period, which would have been the years from 785 to 805, and that he died somewhere after 816. We also know that Zhang Bi admired Li Bai and called himself Zhang Taibai in imitation of Li Bai's self-imposed nickname. He used to call himself Li Taibai. And we also know that Meng Jiao was an admirer of Zhang Bi's poetry, and that's it. So he is a bit displaced chronologically, although you could say that he does probably fit the bill thematically in that his poem, well, pretty similar to some late Tang poets that we've seen dealing with love, sickness, and separation, although again, that's a very common topic in all periods of Tang poetry, although perhaps more typically to be expected in early Tang and late Tang. Anyway, what's this poem about? Okay, well, that got me lost a little bit here. Remember, Chinese poetry is very ambiguous, and, nouns have no indication of gender or of number. So, from the title of this poem, Sent to a Friend, and in the first reading, I imagined it to be a poem of parting, like two men, two friends, have been meeting together. One of them has left, has gone back to his home, and the one that remains, who is the poetic persona of Changbi, sends a poem to his friend's house. And the idea there is the poem would be, making a very quick paraphrase of it, in my own words, it would be, well, after you left, I remembered your house. I sent you a letter, and but it will arrive maybe before you do, or at least while I am writing it and sending it, I am imagining your home empty of your own presence. So that was how I understood it in the first reading. But afterwards, I checked in the internet, as I usually do, some Chinese pages devoted to this anthology, and with the doubtful assistance of Google Translate, I tried to get to the gist of the conventional Chinese interpretation of the poem today, as it might be taught in schools, and I was completely surprised that the meaning completely changed. From what I have glimpsed online, the idea is that the poetic persona, yes, it's a man, but he is writing to a woman. He is writing to a woman with whom he might have fell in love, or he might have felt attracted to her and maybe tried even to start an alliance. So this friend is actually a girl friend. And in that interpretation of the poem, the idea is the poet is sending a letter uh, to this woman. I don't know how she saw her after you left. After you left, where? But anyway, he is thinking about the woman in her house. And the last line, the moon in the courtyard shining on the fallen blossoms, for one no longer there. The one no longer there does not become the person that is being spoken to. It becomes the speaker. So in this interpretation, the poet once visited this lady's house, and now that he is no longer with the person, he is imagining the house again, but devoid of his own presence. And I imagine, well, probably Chinese know much better about the interpretation of this poem than I do, obviously, as they can read it in the original. But after having read this, yeah, I can see how probably the romantic imagery of the second couplet really matches a poem about men and women with a degree of infatuation being separated than it does friends, because, the images of the spring moon of the courtyard and the falling blossoms are images we would typically expect more in a romantic poem about love sickness and separation than in a poem of scholar officials, of friends separating. There we would imagine more conventional, less romantic images of the passage of time and death and the big distances of separation. So sticking to the second reading, I would say this is a romantic poem. A man away from a woman's house after having visited her imagines the empty house devoid of his presence. He doesn't paint us the woman in the poem, but we might imagine the woman is there in the background. The woman would be the one who is seeing the spring moon over the courtyard and the fallen blossoms, who evoke probably in the woman's memory and in the poet's memory their mutual absence from each other. Anyway, so that's the general gist of it. Let's take a look at the poem as usual, couplet by couplet. So first couplet. After you left, I dreamed of visiting your home. The tiny hallway, the curving balustrade. So the poem begins with, after you left. I imagine the you is not present in the original Chinese. Probably the original Chinese has something like after left. So it's not clear who probably has left whom. In this translation, it's clear that it's the person, the addressee, who has left. Which again, that was what made me think of a male addressee, because women generally didn't have as much freedom as men for visiting other people. But anyway, let's assume here that the addressee is a woman. It probably would make more sense in the second interpretation to imagine, instead of after you left, after I left. But anyway, after you left, so after we were separated, perhaps the lady went back to her quarters. She had been in a more public part of the house, and then she went to a more restricted part of the house. So after you left, I dreamed of visiting your home. Or maybe the poet encountered her in some other space in a relative's house, which the woman might have been visiting. But anyway, after she left, the poet imagines the other person's home. I dreamed of visiting your home. The tiny hallway, the curving balustrade. So the second line gives us images of the home. It's curious that the images are of what could be described as secondary spaces of a home, not the main halls or any intimate quarters, but tiny hallway, curving balustrade. So these look like the kind of places where a guest would go, not the inner quarters, but the outer quarters, like a small hallway before the hall, maybe a curving balustrade on the outside of the hall or the pavilion. So what Zhang seems to be reminiscing when he remembers the spaces of a house he visited are actually not the inner sancta sanctorum where the dwellers, and especially the women dwellers, would reside, but the outer portions where perhaps he managed to catch a glimpse or to exchange some words with this presumed female addressee. So I dream of visiting that. So this is a very conventional trope that we've seen in Chinese classical poetry. When a poet falls asleep, part of his soul, when he is in love or when he has a strong affection for someone, flies away and goes to match the other person. So spends all the night traveling, trying to visit the beloved person, whether it be a friend or a woman. So we might imagine Changbi's soul has flown back to the friend's house. What does he encounter there? Well, that's the second couplet. But there was only the spring moon over the courtyard, shining on fallen blossoms, for one no longer there. We get pretty conventional images from Chinese poetry. Conventional images of spring also, which, remember, spring is generally the season of love, of getting together, of universal mating and pairing. So what does the poet see? He sees a moon, the spring moon, in the courtyard, illuminating it. So moon, seeing the moon, is also a pretty common trope in a lot of classical Chinese poetry. Two separated people feeling together because they're looking at the same moon. But anyway, so the poet sees the moon. And what is the moon doing? Well, it's a beautiful sight in itself, but it's shining on fallen blossoms. So fallen blossoms, typical of late spring, they always connote, they're associated with love, they're associated with the fugacity of love and beauty. And so there's this romantic conceit. The moon is shining on fallen blossoms, which, evoke all these tropes of the fugacity of love and of youth and of beauty. And this moonlight is shining on fallen blossoms for one no longer there. So the sad melancholy. So the poet is imagining that the moonlight on the blossoms, on the fallen blossoms, is meant to be for him, but he is not there. So he might imagine that the woman who is probably in the background of this poem is feeling love sickness and is feeling what he states in the last line, that the moonlight shining on the fallen blossoms should be shining on her and the man together, enjoying the sight and thinking together about the fugacity of love and beauty. But they are separated. So yeah, I think that's it. So it would be a pretty clever and oblique poem in the style of some poems we've already encountered, also like Han Wo's and a few others here, in which they're very indirect. They talk about love, but they do it in such a subtle, indirect way that it's probably perceived as very decorous by the classical Chinese. So it's almost so oblique, so indirect as to be really hard to fathom. But, well, interesting piece, as usual.